Berserk. You've probably heard of it. If you haven't, I suggest you would hear of it or read it. It's a manga/anime series with less of an emphasis on the anime but more on the manga. In the former, I only count the 1999 series as something that can be compared to the manga. The 2016 series, well, sucks big time even with its fancy CGI. But let's move on from the technicalities and focus on the topic of discussion. Berserk. Why is it relatable and why are people drawn to it? If you look at Berserk from the surface, you wouldn't find anything that you can relate to. It doesn't have any such relation to reality. Purely a fantasy series, it features goblins, trolls, grey matter from Ben 10, a slightly hotter version of Medusa, the idea of death, knights, warriors, mercenaries, and evil eggs that can cause major damage. So yes, we've established it as a fantasy series without any hint of realism in it. If that were the case, this video would have ended right here and now. But we're not going to end this video. What we are going to explain is that within the elements of fantasy, there are characters, human and non-human alike, who add that hint of relatability within the series. It's these characters and their actions that add that hint of realism and humanity that makes us love the series oh so much. Let's look at some of the characters so you can get a feel for what I'm going on about. The protagonist of the series, Guts, is the primary reason why I'm making this video. The character arc of Guts is relatable not in the sense of his actions and the settings that he found himself in. Its relevance lies in how such situation impacted Guts at a mental level. Let's look at Guts' first experience of betrayal. Gambino, the mercenary who practically raised Guts, sold him to Donovan. In the crudest of words, he pimped him out. Though Guts survived all of that, it left a mark on him that would continue to plague him until he would join the Band of the Hawk after being defeated by Griffith in a duel. There are multiple ways that we can relate this to our real lives. The theme, however, stays that of child abuse and how it impacts children when they grow up. I won't go into the details of this since it is a sensitive topic and I'm not too comfortable talking about it, but what I will say is that children who suffer any kind of abuse grow up not trusting the world, being withdrawn, and being constantly defensive. Betrayal from the people you look up to is never nice, and Guts, as we all know, has faced plenty such betrayals. Which brings me to the Eclipse. A biblical-esque event, the Eclipse is where the insanity of Berserk peaked. It showcased an event that no matter how many times you read through it or watch, gives off the same feelings of apprehension, disgust, hatred, and despair. But to rewind things, it's still a fantasy and only time will tell whether religious prophecies will come true and make such an event a reality. But while it may be a fantasy, the emotions are as real as they can be. It's betrayal of the highest order where one man in pursuit of his selfish ideals decides to sacrifice everything and everyone he ever got close with. Griffith is a cunt, to be honest, but there are people who, driven by a Machiavellian or power-hungry mindset, decide to sacrifice their friendships, camaraderies, and relationships. Griffith was successful in his attempt of reviving his lost glory and becoming a king of darkness while posing as a knight of heaven. This particular action from Griffith has very close ties to reality if you remove the elements of fantasy. In my observations, and I may be wrong, selfish, power-hungry people who readily sacrifice their relationships for their own ends are quite satisfied with what they manage to achieve. Don't get me wrong, there are people who feel guilty about their actions, but there are a select few who feel no remorse for the pain that they inflict on other people. Theirs is a mindset that I don't understand and perhaps never will, but it is a good case study that shows how Griffith's actions aren't just fantasy, and there are surely people who would, out of jealousy and spite, do anything to come above everyone else. Now that we've established that there are cunts like Griffith in the real world, it's time we move on to our protagonist, Guts. Whatever happened to Guts during the eclipse is indeed one of the most tragic scenes in the history of seinen manga. But what's more important, without disregarding the former, is how Guts went through the motions of recovering from such a tragedy. This is where the realism, or more specifically the human behavior of moving on, comes in. When the eclipse was still fresh in his mind, Guts was at the very bottom, ground zero. Nothing worse could happen to him. He struggled alone, lost in the darkness, and eventually embracing it as one and the same as him. This feeling of isolation and coldness wasn't something new to Guts since he had isolated himself from the world before joining the Band of the Hawk. But that was a different time. He hadn't developed the bond that he had developed while being a member of the Hawks. Things were different after the eclipse, since now not only had he lost all his comrades, he saw the person he loved being molested by the man he thought was his best friend. The feelings of revenge are very much called for. However, with time, Guts moved on. He moved on, found people who trusted him again. He developed a bond again, and as the series has stopped, we see a Guts that is a lot more placid than the man we saw post-eclipse. The evolution of Guts from being a marauding killer to someone who has calmed down has a lot of connotations with real life. We've all experienced moments when we are at our lowest. We become hopeless, lost, angry at ourselves and the world, and so on. However, time is one of the best teachers, and eventually we all move on and think back at things from a calmer lens. Does this mean that we forget them? Guts hasn't forgotten, but he has gained perspective, and with time his wounds have healed. So these are some examples of realism from Berserk. I will attempt to continue this series, but for now I hope I made sense because I wrote this in a hurry. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, you can show your support for the channel. Thanks for watching.